17,000 men, 48 manufacturing sites, 9 legendary brands: Austin, Morris, MG, Jaguar, Rover, Land Rover. By 1968, British Leyland controlled 40% of the British car market and was the 5th largest car manufacturer in the world. The government called it a national champion. By 1975, they were all being strangled by the same corporate rope. Here's what the merger actually created: 14 factories, each with its own management, 12 design studios, each protecting its territory, 48 models in production simultaneously, many competing against each other. A part system so broken that a single component passed through 5 warehouses before reaching the factory floor. "Lions led by donkeys," said one union rep at Cowley. Except the lions were being led by donkeys riding other donkeys. Lord Stokes promised synergy. He promised efficiency. He promised British engineering would conquer the world. What he delivered was a masterclass in destroying value. Instead of choosing the best from each company, they kept everything, every redundancy, every inefficiency, every petty rivalry, preserved in the name of industrial harmony. The merger that should have saved British manufacturing murdered it instead. Nobody asked the engineers. That's the part that still rankles 50 years later. British Leyland wasn't created because the people who actually built cars thought it was a good idea. It was created because accountants and civil servants in Whitehall thought British industry needed consolidation. The logic was impeccable if you'd never set foot in a factory. Combine all the small, struggling manufacturers into one large, struggling manufacturer. Economies of scale would naturally follow, except they didn't. The merger was orchestrated by the Industrial Reorganization Corporation, a government body created specifically to force mergers in British industry. Tony Benn, the industry secretary, believed passionately that British manufacturing could only survive if it operated at American scale. He looked at General Motors with its vast integrated production systems and wanted to replicate it in Britain. What he created instead was a confederation of warring tribes, each convinced that their way of building cars was the only correct way. Consider the engineering philosophies. Morris preferred front-wheel drive, transverse engines, and what they called practical family transport. Triumph insisted on rear-wheel drive, traditional layouts, and sporting pretensions. Rover focused on luxury, refinement, and the export market. Jaguar refused to compromise on anything that might affect performance. Land Rover simply wanted to be left alone to build agricultural vehicles in peace. Under the new corporate structure, they all reported to the same board, attended the same meetings, and competed for the same investment capital. The finance directors, freshly installed from corporate headquarters, made decisions based on spreadsheets. If Plant A could produce gearboxes for £12.50 per unit, and Plant B quoted £13.20, then Plant B would be closed regardless of quality, reliability, or the fact that Plant B's gearboxes actually worked. The Allegro's gearbox, sourced from the lowest bidder, became notorious for jumping out of second gear. Dealerships kept spare gearboxes in stock the way corner shops kept cigarettes. The cost saving, 70 pence per unit. The cost and reputation, incalculable. Lord Stokes, previously of Leyland Motors, believed in volume. Build more cars, sell more cars, make more profit. Simple. He set ambitious targets, 1 million cars per year, by 1975. To achieve this, he pushed the existing factories to their limits, often beyond their limits. Quality control became an afterthought. A 1973 report by the Transport and General Workers Union found that 37% of cars leaving Longbridge required rectification work before delivery. The dealers, who bore the cost of fixing these problems, started refusing to accept vehicles. Some Austin dealerships quietly began selling Datsuns. Before the disaster, there was brilliance. Alec Isagonis, the engineer who designed the Mini, worked for British Leyland. So did Spen King, who created the Range Rover. Charles Spencer King, who developed the Rover 5.8 engine. Harry Webster, the engineering director at Triumph. These weren't mediocre talents making do. These were world-class engineers producing genuinely innovative designs. The Mini, launched in 1959, revolutionized small car packaging. The Range Rover, launched in 1970, invented an entire category of vehicle. British Leyland had the talent, it lacked the coherence to use it. Isigonis was famously difficult. He refused to compromise on engineering principles, even when the compromise would have saved money. He designed the Mini with tiny 10-inch wheels because it maximized interior space, even though it made the ride harsh and the tires expensive. He hated market research, claiming that customers didn't know what they wanted until you showed them. He was probably right, but his approach made him enemies in the new corporate structure. When the accountants asked him to redesign the Mini to reduce costs, he told them to bugger off. They found someone more compliant. The replacement for the Mini should have been straightforward. Take the brilliant basic concept, fix the known problems, update the styling, keep the low production costs. What British Leyland produced instead was the Austin Allegro, launched in 1973. It was larger than the Mini, heavier, slower, thirstier, more expensive to build, and universally derided by the motoring press. "All aggro, no go," wrote one magazine. The styling, particularly the infamous square steering wheel, became a national joke. It sold reasonably well. Its first year saw 174,000 units produced, but only because British buyers still felt vaguely patriotic about buying British. That feeling wouldn't last. Spen King had better luck, mainly because he worked in the Rover division, which retained some autonomy. The Range Rover, launched in 1970, was everything British Leyland's volume cars weren't. Carefully engineered, properly developed, beautifully finished. It cost £1,998 at launch, nearly 3 times the price of an Allegro, and the waiting list stretched for 18 months. American buyers paid premium prices for right-hand drive imports. It should have been a template for the entire company. Instead, it was treated as an anomaly, a luxury product that didn't need the same cost disciplines as the mass-market brands. Derek Robinson, convener of shop stewards at Longbridge, became known as Red Robbo in the tabloid press. The newspapers painted him as a communist saboteur, deliberately destroying British industry through strikes and disruption. The reality was more complicated. Robinson represented workers who watched their company make decision after decision that made no sense to anyone who actually built cars for a living. When management announced they would close the Bathgate plant in Scotland, a modern facility opened in 1961, and concentrate production at the aging Castle Bromwich Works, the workers struck. Not because they were communists, but because the decision was obviously stupid. The strike statistics became weaponized. British Leyland lost 4.2 million production days to strikes between 1968 and 1975. The tabloids blamed the unions blamed management. The truth lay in the detail. Many strikes were wildcat actions, unauthorized by union leadership, triggered by immediate grievances, faulty machinery that management refused to repair, bonus payments that arrived late, work practices changed without consultation. At the Cowley plant, a 2-week strike in 1973 started because management installed new time clocks without telling the workers. The clocks didn't work properly. Production stopped. Management blamed the unions for unreasonableness. The workers pointed out that the time clocks were manufactured by a British Leyland subsidiary that was about to be sold to a German company. The productivity numbers told another story. German car workers produced an average of 18.7 cars per worker per year. Japanese workers produced 32.4. British Leyland workers produced 6.8. The tabloids concluded that British workers were lazy. The engineers concluded that British Leyland was catastrophically badly managed. If your production line stops twice a day because the parts didn't arrive, if the machinery breaks down because maintenance was deferred to save money, if you're building 3 different versions of the same car simultaneously because management can't decide which specification to settle on, your productivity will be terrible, regardless of how hard you work. A story from the Triumph plant in Coventry illustrates the problem. In 1974, production of the TR-7 sports car began. The design was controversial. American safety regulations forced a wedge-shaped profile that traditional Triumph customers hated, but the engineering was sound. The plant, however, was a disaster. It was a new facility built specifically for the TR-7, but the machinery kept breaking down. The paint shop couldn't achieve consistent color matching. The body panels supplied from another plant 50 miles away often arrived damaged. When workers raised concerns, management accused them of sabotage. When the inevitable strike happened, the press blamed the unions. The TR-7 was eventually moved to Canley, then to Solihull, then production stopped altogether. Total production run, 112,368 units over 8 years, spread across 3 factories. Porsche built the 911 in one factory for decades. By 1974, British Leyland was losing £20 million per month. The company went to the government with a choice: massive financial support or bankruptcy. Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister, faced an election. Letting British Leyland collapse would cost 170,000 jobs directly, perhaps another 500,000 in the supply chain. The political calculation was simple. The government nationalized British Leyland in 1975, buying out the private shareholders and injecting £1.4 billion of taxpayer money. Nationalization changed nothing and everything. The management structure remained largely intact. The factories kept building the same cars in the same inefficient ways. But now every decision became political. When Michael Edwards, the new chairman appointed in 1977, wanted to close the Speak plant in Liverpool, a facility losing £20 million per year, he needed government approval. The plant stayed open for another 2 years, hemorrhaging money, because closing it was politically awkward. When Edwards wanted to fire Derek Robinson for organizing opposition to his restructuring plans, the conservative opposition praised his toughness, while the Labour left called it class warfare. Robinson was fired eventually. The Longbridge workers went on strike in protest. Production stopped for 7 weeks. Nothing was achieved except further erosion of market share. The government money came with conditions. British Leyland had to maintain employment levels. It had to consult with unions before making major decisions. It had to source components from British suppliers, even when cheaper or better alternatives existed overseas. It had to maintain production at politically sensitive sites. In return for £1.4 billion, the government purchased the right to micromanage a dying company into an even slower death. The irony is that the Conservative government, elected in 1979, on a platform of free market economics and union breaking, continued supporting British Leyland. Margaret Thatcher, who let other industries collapse without intervention, kept writing checks for British Leyland. Between 1975 and 1988, the total government subsidy reached £11 billion in today's money. It bought time, nothing else. By 1988, British Leyland's market share had fallen from 40% to 15%. Ford and Vauxhall, privately owned and profitable, dominated the British market. Japanese imports, once dismissed as cheap imitations, took another 20%. They changed the name to Rover Group in 1986 as if branding could solve structural problems. Jaguar was sold to Ford in 1989. Land Rover went to BMW in 1994, then Ford in 2000, then Tata Motors in 2008. The volume car business, Austin, Morris, Rover, was sold to BMW in 1994 for £800 million. BMW spent 6 years trying to make it work, poured in billions, and gave up. They kept the Mini brand, sold Land Rover to Ford, and gave the rest to a consortium called Phoenix for £10. Not £10 million, £10. Literally. The notional price of a company that once employed 170,000 people. Phoenix, led by 4 businessmen who called themselves the Phoenix Four, promised to revive Rover as an independent British manufacturer. They paid themselves £42 million in salaries and pensions over the next 5 years while the company continued its decline. MG Rover, as it was renamed, collapsed in 2005. The final tally: 5,000 job losses, £1.5 billion in pension fund deficits, and criminal investigations that ultimately went nowhere. The Phoenix Four kept their money. The workers lost their pensions. Longbridge Works, where this story started, is now a housing development and shopping center. Some of the original buildings remain, repurposed as light industrial units and offices. The final car rolled off the line on April 7, 2005, an MGZT saloon, painted black. A small plaque marks the spot, installed by local historians. On sunny days, older men gather there, former workers who spent their lives building cars. They tell stories about the Allegro's square steering wheel, the Marina's rust problems, the Maxi's poor build quality. They laugh, mostly. but the laughter has an edge. The Chinese company SAIC bought the intellectual property rights to the MG brand. They manufacture MG-badged cars in China now, electric vehicles mostly, sold in Britain and Europe. They're competent, affordable, popular. None of them were designed in Britain. None of them are built in Britain. The badge is British. Everything else is gone. What killed British Leyland? The unions, said the right-wing press. Bad management, said the unions. The government, said the managers. Cheap imports, said everyone. They were all correct and all wrong. British Leyland died because it was created without any clear purpose beyond preventing its constituent parts from failing individually. Instead of solving the problems that made small British manufacturers uncompetitive, the merger simply consolidated those problems into one enormous, unmanageable corporation. The design-by-committee approach produced cars that satisfied nobody. The Marina, launched in 1971 as British Leyland's answer to the Ford Cortina, used a development of the 1948 Morris Minor chassis. In 1971, when Ford had already moved to modern unitary construction, when independent rear suspension was becoming standard, British Leyland proudly launched a car with 1940s technology. It was cheap, and it sold in large numbers initially, 807,000 units over 9 years, but mostly because British buyers still felt obligated to buy British. When that obligation faded, so did the Marina's sales. The quality problems became legendary. The Allegro's hydraulic suspension, designed to provide a comfortable ride, leaked. The Marina's rear axle had a tendency to break away suddenly during cornering, leading to several fatal accidents. The Princess's electrical systems failed with such regularity that many owners carried spare fuses as standard equipment. The SD1 Rover, launched in 1976 as a prestige saloon to compete with BMW, was praised for its styling and handling but derided for build quality so poor that the factory workers themselves refused to buy them. Some of the engineering was genuinely advanced. The Maxi, launched in 1969, had a 5-speed gearbox when most competitors offered 4 speeds. It had a hatchback design years before hatchbacks became mainstream. The engine was mounted transversely, driving the front wheels, maximizing interior space. On paper, it should have been a success. In practice, the gear shift was terrible, the styling was awkward, the build quality was poor, and it never found an audience. It remained in production until 1981, mostly because British Leyland couldn't afford to replace it. Visit the British Motor Museum at Gaydon, near Warwick. The collection includes every significant model British Leyland ever produced: the Mini in all its variants, the Range Rover prototype, the original Jaguar E-Type, the TR7 in its wedge-shaped glory, even an Austin Allegro preserved for posterity. The cars sit behind velvet ropes, polished and perfect, maintained by volunteers who remember when these machines represented Britain's industrial future. School children on educational visits learn about the glory days of British manufacturing. The museum is careful not to dwell too much on what came after. The industrial sites tell a different story. Cowley still builds cars, Minis now for BMW. The plant is modern, efficient, employs a fraction of its former workforce. Most of the manufacturing is automated. The workers who remain are skilled technicians maintaining robots, not craftsmen, assembling cars by hand. Solihull still produces Land Rovers and Range Rovers for Tata Motors. It's profitable, successful, exports to 128 countries, but it's an outlier, not a representative example. Most of British Leyland's former factories are gone. Bathgate, closed in 1986, is an industrial park. Speke, closed in 1982, is mostly demolished. Canley, where they built Triumph motorcycles and sports cars, is a business park. The body-pressing plant at Castle Bromwich survived, ironically. It now produces Jaguars for Tata Motors. Longbridge, as mentioned, is housing and retail. The pattern is consistent: demolition, redevelopment, erasure. The buildings vanish. The skills vanish. The institutional knowledge vanishes. Some of the brands survive as intellectual property. MG, as mentioned, is Chinese-owned. Rover exists as a trademark, unused. Triumph sells motorcycles, unrelated to the car manufacturer. Jaguar and Land Rover prosper under Indian ownership, proving that the products weren't inherently flawed, just the company that made them. The Mini, reborn under BMW, is arguably more successful now than it ever was under British ownership. These successes make British Leyland's failure more poignant. The potential was always there. It was the execution that failed. Bob Wilshaw worked at Longbridge for 42 years, started as an apprentice toolmaker in 1963, retired in 2005 when the plant closed. He trained on machinery that dated from the 1940s, learned skills from men who'd learned them from their fathers. He watched the company change names, change ownership, change strategy. He watched his colleagues take redundancy, one wave after another, as the workforce shrank from 17,000 to 5,000. When the end finally came, he wasn't surprised. "We knew," he said in a newspaper interview. "We'd known for years. You just hope it won't happen on your watch. The skills don't transfer." That's the part that policy papers never capture. When a 48-year-old panel beater with 30 years' experience loses his job, he doesn't become a software engineer. He becomes a taxi driver or a security guard, or he takes early retirement and tries not to think about what he used to do. The apprenticeship programs that fed British Leyland, the technical colleges, the training schemes, the progression from apprentice to journeyman to master craftsman, all collapsed along with the company. Birmingham, Coventry, Oxford, all lost their manufacturing identity within a generation. The pension scandal compounded the injury. When MG Rover collapsed in 2005, the pension fund had a deficit of £1.5 billion. Workers who'd paid into the scheme for decades discovered their pensions would pay perhaps 50% of the promised amount. The Pension Protection Fund eventually covered most of the losses, but the uncertainty lasted for years. Men who'd planned their retirement based on a guaranteed pension found themselves working past 70 or applying for benefits or moving in with their children. The Phoenix Four, who extracted £42 million while the company died, faced no consequences. The workers paid the price. The communities never recovered. Longbridge, Cowley, Canley. These weren't just factory sites, they were ecosystems. The factories employed thousands directly, but they supported thousands more indirectly. The cafes where workers ate lunch, the shops where they bought tools, the pubs where they drank after their shift, the bus routes that existed solely to ferry workers to and from the plant. When the factories closed, everything else followed. Longbridge still exists as a place, but it's not the same place. The geography remains. The community was erased. British Leyland failed because it was founded on a lie that consolidation alone would solve fundamental competitive weaknesses. The company combined multiple failing strategies into one enormous failing strategy. It preserved all the inefficiencies of small-scale manufacturing while adding the bureaucratic overhead of a large corporation. It kept brands that competed with each other while eliminating the autonomy that made those brands distinctive. It promised synergy and delivered paralysis. The government's role was contradictory. Nationalization provided the capital British Leyland needed to survive, but it also politicized every decision. Factory closures became election issues. Management changes became news stories. Investment decisions required ministerial approval. The company needed brutal restructuring, plant closures, redundancies, model rationalization, but the government, answerable to voters and unions, wouldn't permit it. So British Leyland lingered, propped up by subsidies, gradually losing market share, until the political will to continue evaporated. The tragedy is that British engineering never stopped being capable. The same country that produced British Leyland also produced McLaren, Lotus, Aston Martin, Morgan, Rolls-Royce. Small manufacturers thrived. The giants collapsed. The lesson seems clear. British industry could compete when it focused on quality, specialization, and engineering excellence. It failed when it tried to compete on volume and price with manufacturers that had superior organization and lower labor costs. Today's automotive industry in Britain is larger than it was in British Leyland's final years. Over 800,000 vehicles were built in Britain in 2024, more than at any point since 2017. But they're built by foreign-owned companies. Nissan in Sunderland, Toyota in Derby, Honda in Swindon, closed now actually, BMW in Oxford, and Cowley, Jaguar Land Rover under Indian ownership. British automotive manufacturing exists. British-owned automotive manufacturing is extinct outside tiny specialist firms. The final question is whether it mattered. A Honda Civic built in Swindon employs British workers, uses British suppliers, generates British tax revenue. Does it matter that the profits go to Tokyo rather than Birmingham? The cultural loss is real. Something valuable was erased when British Leyland died, but perhaps the economic loss was inevitable. Industries decline. Technologies change. Manufacturing moves to wherever offers the best combination of cost, skill, and infrastructure. British Leyland's failure is simply an example of that process. More dramatic and painful than most, but not fundamentally different. Or perhaps that's too easy. British Leyland died because specific people made specific decisions badly. They merged companies that shouldn't have been merged. They appointed managers who didn't understand manufacturing. They designed cars by committee, built them without sufficient quality control, and sold them with inadequate dealer support. These were choices, not inevitabilities. Other countries maintained successful volume car manufacturers. Britain didn't. That's not fate. That's failure. Longbridge Works, 17,000 workers once. Now a Tesco and some housing. No plaque, except a small one installed by local historians, easily missed. The buildings that remain are anonymous, could be anywhere, could be anything. Only the older residents remember what used to be there, and their number diminishes every year. Soon, nobody will remember. The merger that murdered Britain's car industry will become a historical footnote, studied by economics students as a cautionary tale. The men who built the cars, the skills they possessed, the communities they formed, all gone. Confirmed by time. Gone.